Dann würde ich jetzt erstmal Sie und euch hier im Raum herzlich willkommen heißen, gesundes, neues, frohes Jahr wünschen. Kurz nochmal erwähnen, dass Fotos gemacht werden, aber die Gesichter werden nicht gezeigt, nichtsdestotrotz. Also Younes macht die Fotos, wer gar nicht aufs Bild möchte, gerne kurz melden. Und also unsere Vorlesung ist heute auf Englisch. Wir haben hier ganz tolle Geräte, die das simultan auf Deutsch übersetzen. Was ist denn mit Schriftdolmetschen? Hallo, herzlich willkommen. Also das Jahr fängt schon mal gut an mit tollen GästInnen. Wir freuen uns. Vielen bekannten Gesichtern, aber auch viele neue Gesichter hier. Can you hear me, Alex? Can you hear me, Alex?
I can hear you.
Oh, perfect. Great. So we ready? So I'm going to start now in English. Welcome everyone online, here in the room, via Zoom, via YouTube. We wish you in the name of Romani Pen and the Uni Romnja a happy New Year, and happy to welcome so many familiar faces to our lecture series as we started the new year, and also happy to meet new faces. And today we have a special lecture. Unfortunately, Alexandra Oprea wasn't able to make it to Berlin in person, but we are glad that you are here online with us today, and we don't have to miss out on your lecture. And yes, we will take some pictures, so if anyone has a problem in this room, please just tell Younes no picture. And besides that, I just would like to introduce you, Alex, very quick before we start. I know you've been waiting. So, Alex, you are a Romanian Romani attorney, you're an author, you're an activist. Over 15 years ago, you were under the supervision of Kimberlé Crenshaw at the Columbia University and at the UCLA School of Law. You also pioneered the application of the intersectionality theory to Romani women through a series of articles, articulated the gender dimension of Romani civil and human rights struggle. You also were involved in the historic firsts for Romani women's representation in the global arena, most notable through your written and oral advocacy at the 49th session in 2005 of the UN Commission on the Status of the Women, where you called for an intersectional approach to collecting race, gender, intersectionality statistics. And you received your bachelor from the Vassar College, your master from the Columbia University, and your GD from the UCLA School of Law. I know there's so much more you did and you are doing, and I'm very honored to introduce you today here, and looking forward and very happy to hear your lecture now. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Svetlana. Thank you, Jane and University of Humboldt for having me, and Uni Romnja. I'm very happy that you guys have this program. It's really uplifting, and I apologize I could not be there in person, but I hope to join you in February. I want to get right into it. It's sort of hard to believe that all of the things that happened were around 20 years ago, when we were kind of first starting out trying to put Romani women's rights on the map in a formal sense. And really not much has changed. I'm going to be reading from a chapter in a book, which I hope you guys go out and get. My good friend Magda Matake edited it. I believe she spoke to you guys a couple of weeks ago. So my particular chapter is on applying critical race theory to reproductive rights. So I hope I get through all of it. And if not, then you guys can just pick up the book and read it, or I can email you the chapter. So this is from an earlier work. I've started a new position, and so I haven't had a chance to really look over this chapter as much and make sure it's updated, but around 90% of what is in here is still relevant today. You'll soon see. So this chapter focuses on two interrelated violations of Roma women's reproductive rights: compulsory sterilization and child removal, foregrounding the experience of Roma women who were sterilized, and interrogates traditional human rights, anti-racist, and feminist discourses through a critical race theory lens, and aims to construct a more inclusive discourse on reproductive rights and a more robust jurisprudence on discrimination. So before I go into it, I like to situate myself and basically show how I came to this understanding around 20 or so years ago. So I was exposed to critical race theory around 21 years ago, actually, under the guidance of Kimberlé Crenshaw and Luke Harris, who were both co-founders of the African American Policy Forum. Critical race theory essentially was developed by legal. Hello. Oh, the thing went out. Am I on? Okay, sorry. So critical race theory was developed by legal scholars of color, and it challenges the constructions of racial hierarchy in America and subordination of people of color. And as I've read Crenshaw's groundbreaking work, I remember for the first time feeling a sense of comfort and relief that what I saw was not just in my head, that I wasn't the one that was crazy. And by interrogating these hierarchies that were taken as a given, taken as natural, and exploring the ways the law helped construct these hierarchies, CRT departed from the traditional narratives on race and meritocracy in America. And I soon saw how it could be used for Roma in Europe as well, because we were going through have very similar histories. So the main tenets of CRT that form the foundation for analyzing rights claims are, one, the focus on institutionalized racism as opposed to individual acts and intent and direct discrimination. Two, the notion that the law can act to actually legitimize structures of subordination. Three, the belief that there's value in anecdotal evidence, including the narratives of minorities. And four, a bottom of those experiencing the intersecting axes of subordination. So the theory of intersectionality, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with if you're in this class or this lecture, resonated with me personally. It adopts a bottom-up approach to address structural intersectionality and addresses the tenets I just mentioned. It looks at the convergence of different forms of oppression and how they operate to limit the individuals, life opportunities of individuals in various groups. And it lends itself to analysis of group-based discrimination, while also considering various vulnerable groups to which a person may belong. The theory of intersectionality has been instrumental in understanding multiple forms of discrimination to which Roma women have been subject. Aside from instances of the marginalization mentioned above, intersectionality helped explain the unique position of Roma women, one that coincides neither with that of Roma men nor with that of Gajikane white women. As Crenshaw explained in her groundbreaking work, Black women can experience discrimination in ways that are both similar to and different from those experienced by white women and Black men. Black women sometimes experience discrimination ways similar to white women's experiences. Sometimes they share experiences with Black men. And sometimes the combined effects discriminate against Black women in a way that's very unique to them. So they often experience double discrimination, the combined effects of these practices based on race and gender. And again, I start with race and gender, and most of my work focuses on race and gender, but these are just the starting point. There are other axes of subordination, disability. There's a lot of good work being done on LGBTQI, Roma, various other axes. So this framework is useful for analyzing discrimination facing Roma women as they face domestic violence as women. They face police brutality as Roma, and sometimes because they face the same. Sorry, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. Because they're subject to the same types of violence faced by the more dominant members of each oppressed group, non-Roma women and Roma men, they're able to represent domestic and international claims of both groups. So my whole argument is that essentially Roma women should form the bases of various plaintiffs' class, because when you start with the oppression faced by Roma women, you get to the other types of oppression, because there's nothing that white Gaje women face that we don't, and there's nothing that Roma men face that we don't. So that is my argument in this paper. Reading it now all over just, gosh, really gets me fired up. All right. So what I mean is that Roma women experience both race and gender discrimination in addition to, or rather, in combination with other axes of subordination, such as poverty, disability, and so forth. As Mari Matsuda has pointed out, looking to the bottom-up approach I referred to, adopting the perspective of those who have seen and felt the falsity of the liberal promise can assist critical scholars in the task of fathoming the phenomenology of law and defining elements of justice. This is an effort to deviate from analyzing in the abstract, right? Knowledge of how people experience oppression, or knowledge of the full range of conditions under which they remain oppressed, exposes new problems and possibilities. So much of the law as we know it is not fashioned from the bottom up, but from the top down, right? Crenshaw explains that because gender discrimination claims have been fashioned based on the experiences of white women, and race discrimination claims have been fashioned based on the experiences of Black men, the courts often erase Black women and fail to understand their vulnerabilities. Sometimes Black women were not able to claim gender discrimination because their race somehow tainted their womanhood, and sometimes they were not able to represent race-based claims because of their gender. So those are just some of that is where essentially intersectionality in terms of the class actions, that's sort of how it was generated, looking at different types of claims that Black women could and couldn't bring. And I started to see some parallels in the European Court of Human Rights. But there's another dilemma, right? When you attempt to cross-pollinate the axes of subordination of gender and race, and when you have unique sui generis is what how I refer to it, you have the unique discrimination that's only faced by women of color. Those are also instances where the courts fail to see and fail to recognize the harms faced by women of color. And in the situation I'll describe would be Roma women. So here I recall some of the reactions that in my early days, where there was the attempts to sort of discuss both race and gender in political discourses. So it wasn't in the courts at that point. For example, attempts to draw attention to domestic violence at Roma rights conferences are met with the retort, quote, "What does domestic violence have to do with Roma?" So these are I'm picking up from my experiences and that of other activists, where we would show up to conferences that were either about Roma, and we would want to speak about something that affects Roma, namely Roma women, children. And we were told that basically we were at the wrong conference, that we're going to be speaking about Roma, not about domestic violence, because that's a sort of a different issue. That's a gender thing. That's a white women's issue. And similar things happen when we would try to bring up, say, police brutality at meetings of the European Women's Lobby back in the day. So I'm going to fast forward through this because I see I have 30 minutes left and I have a lot to get through. So basically, I'm going to be focusing on the compulsory sterilization, because I think a lot of folks who heard about the cases in the European Court of Human Rights are under the impression that these were victories, and to some extent they were, but I want to try to explain how they were partial victories. In order to do that, I sort of need to lay the groundwork, so I hope you bear with me, because it's going to be essential in analyzing the judgments. So, like Native American women, African American women, Roma have a long history of subordination at the hands of white supremacy. The gendered articulation of this white supremacy have led to the implementations of laws and policies that restrict reproductive freedom of these women and expand the control of the state over their bodies. Just as the rape of Black women by white slave masters was essential to the perpetuation of the system of slavery in the US, so too was the rape of Roma women in the area now known as Romania, where Roma were enslaved for 400 years. In fact, rape of this sort did not actually constitute a crime. So rape of a Roma woman was not considered a crime during slavery in Romania. Along with this, a history of the stereotype of the Roma seductress that we're all familiar with, right? Esmeralda, Victor Hugo's Esmeralda, Bizet's Carmen, La Gitanilla, reminiscent of the Jezebel trope, which was very much alive and well in antebellum America. These tropes and stereotypes serve to justify the rape of Black women and Roma women. So even though they're on different continents, right, the similarities are striking. Like they take pages out of each other's books. So just a crime under Romanian law, as I mentioned, it was not illegal to rape a Roma woman. So it was not a crime under Romanian law. Ian Hancock points out that according to the Moldavian Code in the 1900s, and this is a direct quote, if a gypsy slave should rape a white woman, he would be burnt alive. Okay, so that's the penalty for raping a white woman. But if a Romanian should meet a girl in the road and yield to love, he shall not be punished at all. Clearly, girl in the road is not a white woman, refers to Roma women. And that's from the work of Ian Hancock. The hypersexualized Roma trope basically has served to justify a host of oppressive policies against Roma women. And the characterization of Roma women as wildly fertile and sexually promiscuous is a key component to justifying this forced sterilization. I'm sure I don't have to go through too many examples of how fertile Roma women are considered and how promiscuous. We all, I'm sure, have seen things in the media, you guys more than I have, right? Because you're in Europe and that's sort of where it seems to be more prevalent. I go over a couple of examples of this, but I'm sure that the image comes to mind of a Roma woman on the street with numerous children, or a Roma woman who's, trying to get state subsidies by having more children. These are the types of tropes that I'm talking about that serve to inform often on an unconscious basis, a lot of policies against Roma women. So these stereotypes are prevalent in various spheres and discourses, and it's a stereotype that is shared by medical professionals. So I'm going to be talking about the Slovakia case. So here I mentioned Slovakian doctors. A Slovakian doctor commented that Roma women, quote, this is a doctor, a medical professional, right? They have several partners, are promiscuous, the doctor says. They travel a lot and they bring diseases with them from other countries. Okay. So imagine you're a Roma woman and you're seeking treatment at that doctor with those types of beliefs about you. In 2014, a Romanian politician, Rares Bulja, suggested that ideally a Roma woman should be sterilized after her first child if social workers found that she does not have the, quote, intention of raising the child in humane conditions. So this is a politician uttering this. And the same report with which that quote appeared referenced other racist statements made by Romanian politicians, including then Prime Minister, and the then President. But this thinking also comes from less predictable sources, and we find it in well-intentioned human rights discourse a lot of times when they're discussing the link between poverty and high birth rates, right? So that's another iteration of this trope, and it's another sort of blame the victim response. So by 2003, a pattern of compulsory sterilization was documented in reports from countries such as Slovakia. The sterilizations were later formed the basis of the case in the European Court of Human Rights. Forced sterilization of Roma women in what was then Czechoslovakia began in the early 1970s. And if you guys are mostly familiar with that history, I can skip it, but I'm going to assume that you're not familiar with it because I wasn't. So sometimes the sterilizations were accomplished without the woman's knowledge, sometimes through blunt force, coercion, or by taking advantage of structural conditions such as high illiteracy rates among the Roma. Often the sterilizations were accomplished by relying on both the structural vulnerability of Roma women and on coercion and duress. The ability of medical professionals to deploy forceful and coercive tactics was a result of pre-existing structures that already rendered Roma women easy targets, essentially, as illustrated in the testimony of one woman, Agata, 28, from Svinja. This is her quote. I was in terrible pain, but I was not given any pills, any injection. Later on, doctors came, brought me to the operating room for a C-section, and then they gave me anesthesia. When I was falling asleep, a nurse came, took my hand in hers, and with it, she signed something. I don't know what it was. I could not check because I cannot read. I only know how to sign my name. And moreover, I was sleepy and tired. When I was released from the hospital, I was told I would not have any more children. I was so healthy before, but now I have pain all the time and lots of infections. Compulsory sterilization in this case is not only human rights abuse, it's better understood as one manifestation of structural abuse. And it's my feeling that we've only scraped the surface, that whatever we've seen in the case that I'm about to discuss in BC, Slovakia, only scrapes the surface. How many women were unable to bring cases? How many women were illiterate? How many women didn't realize that that's what had happened to them? So again, it's part of a larger continuum of violence and discrimination against Roma women. And that's the crux of my argument. So because the intersectional nature of compulsory sterilization, the practice is often excluded from mainstream feminist debates altogether and is framed unidimensionally in anti-racist Roma debates. So a lot of times when you had forced and coerced sterilization discussed in Roma settings, it would be framed as an act of genocide, an assault on the group as a whole, sort of erasing the gendered component. But excluding gender from this analysis obscures a key facet that the other side, of course, in forced sterilization is compulsory childbirth, right? So if you have race-centered framing underline the discourse and frame it as an act of assault on Roma as a whole and an act of genocide, then the other side of the coin is it's the woman's duty to keep the race going, to have as many children as possible, right? So that's what you lose, one of the things you lose when you're speaking in race-only terms. So back to the human rights discourses. Some feminist entities also ignored forced sterilization. And actually, it's still relevant today because I was looking over some reports by FEM committee of the European Parliament, I believe it was, and it was on reproductive rights. And Roma women were mentioned, I was surprised, 3 times, but it was all at the end of the report in an annex. And that annex wasn't produced by this group. The annex was from CEDAW that had mentioned compulsory sterilization of Roma women and wanted to put certain protocols in place to ensure that there's informed consent. So that is how we even make it into discourses, just as an annex, token representation, the exact opposite of a bottom-up approach, right? And it's very relevant now in reproductive rights discourses as we see the assault on reproductive rights and access to abortion and contraception and all of that, because it becomes more ripe for the erasure of Roma women's experiences, right? And you actually see that it bears out in current reports as well. Unfortunately, I was hoping something would have changed. So we have 20 minutes left. Okay. The European Women's Lobby, I go through an example this is from 2017. The organization's overarching goal was stated as, quote, equality between men and women, without mentioning equality between different races, right? And we see that in a lot of feminist organizations. And we saw similar things in Roma rights organizations. So that's the dilemma of intersectionality that you guys are all familiar with. They make reference, the European Women's Lobby had made reference to the Beijing Platform for Action, the UN Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, without mentioning CERD, right? The Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. So again, you see the erasure in feminist circles of racism because it's not faced by white women, right? So this colorblind ideology carries into discourse and reproductive rights, policies of different organizations. For instance, this is a quote from one of the reports, I think it was produced by the European Women's Lobby. The quote is, for too many Slovak women, modern contraceptives remain tragically out of reach. You know who they don't remain tragically out of reach for? The women that were sterilized. That never factored into this report or into their calculus. That's not to say that Romani women don't need access to contraceptives or that this is the only issue that we face. It's an issue for us and it's cost prohibitive and all of that. This is just to show the extent to which our voices and our experiences are erased in these discourses when our experiences are tokenized or are rendered marginal, right? And the colorblind ideology. So this feminist focus on gender and identification of male domination as a source of reproductive repression overlooks the importance of racism in shaping our understanding of reproductive liberty. And that's certainly the case for Roma women. I'm going to speak now about the jurisprudence, because whereas sterilization was erased in some contexts, such as feminist contexts and such, it did make it to the European Court of Human Rights. And I'm going to be basically discussing that there was a partial victory, and that even though they were present, the Roma women's cases were present in the court, they were still rendered invisible. I'm going to be speaking also about how important it is, and actually I won't get to this part, so you guys will just have to read the paper. I'm going to be speaking about how we can learn a lot about jurisprudence, not only by the court's actual cases and the cases that made it to the European Court of Human Rights, but the cases that don't make it there, right? By the omissions. We learn a lot in terms of the normative vision that the court has of social justice and what discrimination is and what's in legitimate human rights abuse. So historically, Roma women have rarely been at the center of human rights discourse and litigation, be it gender-based human rights or race-based human rights. The marginalization is all the more concerning in light of the fact that human rights law was fashioned as a response to marginalization, right? So that's the more alarming part, because this is supposed to be it for us. This is supposed to be our refuge. This is supposed to be our remedy. Human rights developed as a counter to international law, the international law system, which privileges the rights of nation states, right? And nation states being the main actors. The impetus behind the development of human rights law was to temper preoccupation with state sovereignty and limit the sovereignty, especially as it applied to minorities. It aimed to protect individuals and groups. But we now confront a bifurcation, right? And any student of the UN knows that there is a bifurcation between civil and political rights on the one hand, and economic, social, and cultural rights, which were sort of did not take precedence, right? And so it was a product. I go through a little bit of the history in the article. It was a product of the advent of the Cold War, the dissolution of post-World War II compact that produced the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and how this bifurcation and divorcing civil and political rights from economic, social, and cultural rights made rights less tangible and basically further subordinated vulnerable groups for whom these rights could not be separated, right? So you want to give me the right to vote. What does that really mean to me when I can't eat, or I can't feed my family, and I can't even take off from work, to go and vote. So these rights are intertwined, and the way in which the system kind of separated them out rendered them less than useful for a lot of folks. And the same thing happened, as I discussed earlier, with race and gender, right? There was CEDAW, and then there was CERD, bifurcation of race on the one hand, racism, gender, and patriarchy on the other hand, because Romani women and other women of color's experiences were not centralized. It was mainly movements led by men who experienced racism but not sexism, and white women, or majority women, I should say, who did not experience racism. And so that kind of perpetuated the subordination, even at the international law system that was supposed to address some of these ills, right? So between 2009 and 2012, these are the cases I had focused on. There may be other cases in the meantime that surfaced, but the European Court of Human Rights adjudicated a host of compulsory sterilization cases brought by Roma women against Slovakia. In each instance, the court ruled in favor of the applicants. So that's great. They found Slovakia liable to the women for violations of the Convention on Protection of Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms, primarily in relation to Article 3, which prohibits torture, and Article 8, which mandates respect for family life. I focus on VC versus Slovakia because it set a precedent for the treatment of these claims with respect to Article 14, which prohibits discrimination based on race, gender, and other group markers. So VC versus Slovakia was cited for the principle that laws and practices can disparately impact a certain group while failing to be discriminatory toward that group. If that's difficult to understand for you, that's because it makes no goddamn sense. It makes no sense. So the fact that the court refused to find Article 14 discrimination is a huge issue here. It sort of sets what happened to these women as sort of an unfortunate accident committed by a couple of bad actors, right? But it's not really discrimination as we know it. And this is not the only instance in which the court does this. And I go through the various, I break down sort of the judgment and why the court believed it didn't qualify as Article 14 discrimination in the paper. So I'll just highlight some of the key pieces. So the woman was sterilized in BC versus Slovakia, right? And she alleged a violation of Article 3, Article 8, and Article 14 discrimination. And this is what the applicant described, right? So this is what was before the court. Described having been asked by hospital staff to agree to a sterilization procedure while she was in labor, while in the birthing position, more than 2 hours into labor, while she was writhing in pain. She was asked to sign by the words, "Patient requests sterilization," while she was in labor, okay? Anyone who's been in labor can sort of try to imagine that scenario. And under these already coercive circumstances, the hospital staff falsely represented to her that her life and the life of the baby would be in danger were she to become pregnant again. So it was found that in her medical chart, it indicated she was Roma. Okay, so we have being in labor, 2 hours into labor, writhing in pain, asked to sign that you request sterilization, being lied to and told that if you're going to have another baby, your life and the life of the baby are going to be in danger. The chart said she was Roma. And Roma women at this facility, the applicant presented evidence that they were placed in a segregated maternity ward, right? Which is fairly common. It's fairly common. I've read a lot about the segregated wards and sort of this medical apartheid that takes place in maternity wards in Europe. So what do we have so far? We have indication that she's Roma, so her race on the chart. We have Roma women systematically being placed in different wards separated from white women. We have the conditions under which she was forced to agree to the practice, right? While in labor, her hand was, she was asked to sign by a couple of words. So all the indications are there that this was discriminatory in nature, right? At least to me. And so let's see what the court found. So, in addition to that evidence, right? And it's sort of smoking gun evidence, right? Said Roma in our chart. Women are segregated. In addition, various NGOs came forward with evidence that there was a pattern of forced sterilization of Roma women in Slovakia. She presented historical evidence of communist policy toward Roma, including details relating to the disproportionate number of Roma women sterilized. She showed that in the Prešov district where she resided, 60% of the sterilizations performed from 1986 to 87 were performed on Roma women. So she showed the particular history of that district and the way it targeted Roma women for sterilization. So they made up 60% of those who were sterilized, but they only made up 7% of the population. And other reports were also added into the mix, showing the statistical, the overrepresentation of Roma women among the sterilized populations and pointing to the disparity. In addition, The evidence showed that a disproportionate number of the sterilization was products of a conscious intent to target a specific group, right? So a lot of the times both in the US in anti-discrimination law and in human rights courts, we look for intent. We want the actual smoking gun evidence. I'm targeting you because you are a G word, right? Or you're a dirty G word, something of that nature. So this case came very close to that, where they showed intent. They showed evidence that the 1972 sterilization regulation, so the history of that particular district, they showed that it was deployed to, quote, control the unhealthy Roma population. They also gave the court evidence of the commission for the question of gypsy inhabitants that had input from healthcare professionals, the reasons that sort of meticulously documented the low demand for sterilizations among Roma and how to combat that and how to get Roma to sign up for sterilizations, basically. These were reports that the state had produced and that the applicant showed the court. And so one of the reports said something like, even a backward gypsy woman is able to calculate that from an economic point of view, it's more advantageous for her to give birth every year because she gets significantly more financial resources from the state for the fifth and later descendants. She can get more than the benefit of sterilization. Therefore, health workers recommend increasing the grant for sterilization to 5,000 crowns. So this is a direct policy targeting Roma women. The court was presented with this evidence. In addition to showing that Roma women were given incentives to be sterilized historically, they were reminded that the success of medical professionals was measured by the number of Roma women they got to consent to be sterilized. So all of these were in the reports presented to the court, echoed by NGOs. And the applicant stressed that her racial background was what motivated the sterilization, right? She presented a twofold argument. She claimed that, on the one hand, the pattern and practice of discrimination against Roma, a Roma woman, existed in Slovakia, and two, these broader patterns and racist structure informed a doctor's decision to sterilize her. It seems like she had to go through great pains to really tease out this argument that to a lot of us seems very in your face, very blatant, that she was targeted because she was Roma, and therefore there's a discriminatory element there. And so the high burden that is put on these applicants is really just, it's surreal. It's surreal. So again, they reiterate that it indicated in her medical record that she was Roma. The maternity wards were segregated. It reiterated the whole history of targeting Roma, specifically with incentives for sterilization, etc. And this is the court's conclusion, okay? So in order to establish an Article 14 discrimination claim, the applicant must show that the violations were committed, that were committed were either intentional or part of an organized policy, right? That's what you have to do to establish a prima facie case. The court concluded that they were neither. The materials before the court indicate that the practice of sterilization without their prior informed consent affected vulnerable individuals from various ethnic groups. The court has held that the information available is not sufficient to demonstrate in a convincing manner that the doctors acted in bad faith with the intent of ill-treating the applicant. Similarly, notwithstanding the fact that applicant's sterilization without her consent calls for serious criticism, the objective evidence is not sufficiently strong in itself to convince the court that it was part of an organized policy or that the hospital staff's conduct was intentionally racially motivated. Okay. So the court could not find intent. That was their focus, to find intent, even though it could have sort of hung the Article 14 discrimination claim on an organized policy. Again, you see the huge burden put on the applicants and sort of the mental gymnastics that you have to do to even understand this claim in any way other than a discriminatory claim. It kind of boggles the mind, right? So the historical evidence, statistical evidence, anecdotal evidence was not enough to establish an Article 14 claim. So I see I have 2 minutes left. If that's, and it'll be 45 minutes. Svetlana, am I okay to continue, or should I pause for questions? Essentially, that is the crux of my argument, that that intersectionality is misunderstood. Romani women are rendered invisible in the courts, right? Even in the partial wins that we have, we're still rendered invisible. And there is a recent case, I believe it's JJ v. Croatia, where again, it's a different context. It's incest, and the court refuses to find discriminatory intent in the police's failure to respond to the investigation, to calls for investigation into the practice, into what had happened to the applicant. So there's a refusal. We have on the table a refusal to acknowledge the treatment of Roma women, violence against Roma women, as discriminatory, right? We have a lack of inclusion in relevant discourses that are sort of failing to see Romani women's oppression, or outright ignoring it, or framing it as part of something different for their own ends. And it's part of a larger continuum, I argue, of violence and discrimination against Roma women, and the silencing and essentially a dismissal of Romani women's pain. Because to the extent you're not acknowledging that the coerced sterilizations were discriminatory, that is not an actual win. That is not a win. That is not, that is more of a dismissal of Romani women's discrimination, fashioning it or framing it as something other than discriminatory conduct, right? And placing that kind of burden on these women. So I'm not sure if there are questions, but I wanted to leave you with sort of 2 pictures that really, that's the timer, 2 pictures that really sum up.
I'm sorry, you still have 15 minutes left.
Oh, I do?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Do you guys want me to continue talk, or do you want to ask questions? Continue talking?
Well, you can at least take 10 minutes.
Okay, perfect. Okay. So so we were at the court refusing to find Article 14 discrimination. So I also point back to critical race theory, right? And how critical race theory should really be informing human rights jurisprudence, and how useful it is. Because if the focus had been on something other than intent, right? On unconscious bias, on bias and discrimination the way it's faced most often, which is in a covert way, right? Not in an overt way, not in an intentional way. If the focus had been on unconscious bias and in practices and structural discrimination, the court may have arrived at a different conclusion. So the chapter goes into that for a bit. And so the hurdles are presented, they're presented by the applicant's intersectional identity, right? The court was not doctrinally equipped to understand racial discrimination, much less discrimination based on more than one axis of discrimination. The court and the convention's treatment of race and gender as 2 separate and unrelated markers, again, there I refer back to CERD and CEDAW, that also treats race and gender separately, makes it difficult for plaintiffs who do not fit neatly into the boxes of race-only discrimination or gender-only discrimination. So the fact that Roma men were not subject to sterilization impacted the court's ability to see the race discrimination claim. Specifically, if only Roma women were targeted and not all Roma, how organized could the policy have been, right? Because you have to show an organized policy for Article 14 discrimination. Well, if it didn't target Roma men, was it really an organized policy, right? So this is how the court is thinking in bifurcated terms and using Roma men, for instance, as the prototype. And how racial could it have been if it only targeted women, right? I don't mean to imply that if both Roma men and women were sterilized, the court would find that a racial discrimination case was established, because the court has been reluctant to do so, even in instances where plaintiffs are Roma men. So there have been issues there with Article 14 discrimination. My point is that the substantial limitations imposed by the use of the court's use of the intent doctrine, because in many instances, Roma women are not considered Roma, right? So it's worth noting that the court did not analyze the applicant's gender discrimination claim, because she brought both a race and a gender discrimination claim under Article 14, where she claimed that the sterilization amounted to an act of violence against women. Yet it mentioned that women from various ethnic groups are subject to this procedure, but it did not mention, it did not go into detail what other ethnic groups specifically were also targeted. The court did not discuss that in its opinion. The court essentially ignored the claim, the gender claim, and immediately dove into the racial aspect, right? So this is in large part due to the previously discussed conceptualization of gender claims mainly through a lens of white women. So it didn't even bother to really look at the gender claim or see this through that type of a gendered lens. It went right into the race claim and then did not find discrimination because it wasn't organized enough policy, there wasn't intent to target all Roma, etc. So the outcomes of the compulsory sterilization cases represent limited victories. Their progress because, for once, Roma women were placed at the center of human rights legal discourse, and individual women obtained redress. But their limited piecemeal approaches to justice based on the impact on the individual. The outcomes of these cases render Roma women legally invisible by failing to take into account their sui generis discrimination claim, their unique claim based on their intersectional identity, and by failing to recognize the claim as an instance of both race and gender discrimination under Article 14. So an infringement on Roma women's reproductive rights is an instance of race discrimination, of gender discrimination, and an instance of intersectional discrimination, but the court did not see either of those perspectives. Excuse me. Another type of interference with reproductive rights that I discuss in the chapter is child removal, right? So this we see the trope, right, in the background of the fertile Romani woman, the temptress. Now we're going to see the one of the bad mother, the one that doesn't take care of her kids, that sends them begging, that you name it, she does it. The one that hits her kids, et cetera, et cetera. And that informs a lot of the child removal policies in Europe historically and currently. So while the compulsory sterilization garnered some attention in the European Court of Human Rights, the placement of Roma children into state custody has yet to do so. The removal of Roma children is as much of an infringement on Roma women's reproductive rights as is compulsory sterilization. This issue of child removal became most pronounced in 2013 with the high-profile removal of blonde children from Roma parents. I think everybody remembers little blonde angel, Maria. The case of Maria in Greece, as well as a recent, or then recent, I wrote this in 2018, cases in Ireland and Italy illustrate an egregious disregard for Roma parental rights. These are only the most visible manifestations of a systemic policy that views Roma mothers, like Black mothers, as welfare queens, hypersexual, irresponsible, and unfit to be parents. Ascribed maternal deficiencies informed by stereotypical ideas of Roma women combined with poverty and cultural bias to produce an institutionalized preference for the removal of Romani children as opposed to keeping them with their families. And this has historical precedent, right? During communism, removal of Roma children was part and parcel of the Eastern European reform initiatives. Roma children were placed in residential facilities as part of a rescue and remove plan for children living in poverty or who were born out of wedlock or from families where a person had been incarcerated. And since we know that born out of wedlock, Roma marriages are often not recognized by the state, more Roma children are likely to fall into that bucket. As far as having a parent who's been incarcerated, we know the criminal justice system is biased and that Roma are disproportionately represented in jails and in prisons. So again, using that as a reason to remove children is going to have Romani children be overrepresented in these state facilities. The exact percentage of Roma children in state custody are difficult to ascertain. Due to prohibitions on collection of racial data in many European countries, but the disparity is undeniable. It's estimated that anywhere from 30 to 90% of children in state custody are Roma, while Roma make up 3 to 12% of the general population. So racism is what triggers the initial scrutiny, right, of child welfare workers. It's an issue of both direct and structural marginalization. And we remember the airwaves being saturated with images of brown-skinned Roma parents and the blonde child. And the type of discrimination is characteristic of a racial ideology that is informed by notions of racial purity, right? And the binary schema of shortcuts that are used in law enforcement for criminality, which is racial profiling. These simplifying markers, racial heuristics, if you will, are unidirectional. That is, suspicion is not evenly distributed, but is mostly thrust upon Black or brown parents with light-skinned children, as opposed to light-skinned parents with brown or Black children. Then it's assumed they're probably adopted, right? So all of these systems come into play: the profiling, the criminality, unfit parenthood. And my aim is to basically broaden the reproductive rights discourse to include compulsory and forced sterilization, to include child removal, to include the right to state subsidies so you can feed your children, right? All of these are part of reproductive rights discourse. It's not just limited to access to contraceptives and abortion, the way we traditionally know it, right? And centering Romani women's experiences can help us broaden the discourse. Am I okay on time?
I think that would be a good point to switch to the questions.
Okay, so this is, and I will share my screen real quick because this is, I think this is part of a continuum of violence against, right, Roma women. What's more painful than removing your child? What's more painful than getting sterilized? Not knowing if having a family is important to us, right, and is a human right, then that's pretty much as painful as it gets. And there's this systematic dismissal of Romani women's pain, both in an actual harming that takes place, right, and then the dismissal of this pain in the legal structures. And I wanted to share a couple of pictures with you that sort of shows what I mean by sort of an insensitivity to Romani women's pain and violence against Romani women. I think you guys remember this. If you can see my screen. Can you see my screen? Can you see?
Yes, we can.
What is it? Wait, is it the... Does it show the young girl being kicked by the shopkeeper? Is that the one? Right. So that image always haunted me. right? Not only dismissal of Romani women's pain, dismissal of Romani girls' pain, folks walking by. And I want to leave you with another image. And these, I guess, concepts are difficult, to kind of drive home. But these pictures, I think, went viral. Are you guys seeing the next one?
We still see the first one and your cursor, but now we see the next one.
I think you guys remember the case in Italy where the folks were just sunbathing while the bodies of two young Roma girls, Christina and this article says Viola, but another one said Violeta. Just corpses. Folks just sunbathing like nothing else is, like it's not really important. And these two images kind of haunt me in terms of the insensitivity to violence faced by Romani women and girls and the way it's normalized in Europe. So to a large extent, these decisions that the courts are making are not really surprising, right? Because it's part of this broader picture of how we're neglected and harmed. I think that's it for my talk.
Ja, erzähl. Müssen beide reden.
Yes.
Ist das Mikro?
Sie wird nichts hören über das Mikro. Ich muss mit dem Laptop probieren.
Ah, okay.
In
Yeah,
English?
thank you so much. Yes, we're gonna give you the questions in English, and I really barely have words for your lecture. I have to sit down. It gets me upset, even though I was reading. Also, it's a subject that I'm working to as well on reproductive justice, but it still upsets me, and it's still the images. Sind wir bereit? So, yes, thank you so much. And I think we have some questions here in the audience. How should we do it? Do we call the audience here, or we go with the laptop, or what's best? We're just trying to figure out a way how we're going to...
Sure.
I think it would be good if the audience would come here. Does anyone has
Or you can give me the question, I can repeat it if you feel more comfortable, but you're welcome to come and use the mic. Jane, willst du anfangen? Ja.
Kannst du es übersetzen? Das ist ja sowieso.
Ich brauche doch länger, nee. Ich glaube, Steff, komm her, die machen es besser als ich.
Nee.
Ach so, ich muss es, okay, was möchtest du, aber, oh Mann, bitte eine leichte Frage.
Genau, danke bitte nochmal für den tollen Vortrag.
Jane says thank you very much.
Mich würde interessieren, gibt es denn, kennt sie noch andere Länder außer der Slowakei, also Tschechoslowakei, in denen diese Zwangssterilisationen stattfanden oder stattfinden?
Okay, and Jane is interested to know if there are other countries besides the Czech and the Slovakia that you're aware of that have sterilized Romani women.
That's a good question. There were some in the footnotes, but again, and that's an excellent question also, because the real question should be, are there other instances where we are aware that this has happened, or that have been brought to the European Court of Human Rights, or where women have, gotten attorneys and been able to, overcome the shame that's associated, or who are able to even know that this had happened to them, and come forward, or did they die of an infection, right? Or were they silenced, or did nobody believe them, right? So there are all these layers, but there are other known instances, and I can send you some of it from the footnotes, because there are other known instances, and I'm pretty sure Romania is one of them. But I have to look into that and get back to you. But it's, right, we're scraping the surface.
Thank you. there further questions here in the room? Ja, Jane.
Kannst du kurz eine Rückfrage stellen? Also die Tschechoslowakei war aber das einzige Land, wo es ein Gesetz auch gab. Ne?
Oh, so yeah, that's a good question as well. Jane is asking, but in Czech there was that the only country that had that law of coercive sterilization of Romani women, or do you know if there has been other laws? I mean, there was laws
You mean aside from
after World War
Nazis?
II.
Oh, yeah, well, okay, so I'm not sure, but I can look into that for you. I think the cases that made it to the European Court of Human Rights were largely, Slovakia-related cases, but there were other ones, and I can get back to you on that, of the other cases. But I mean, the idea is not really new, right? So it was during the right. It happened. The whole experimentation on Roma women and medical abuse theme is not foreign to us, right? Like, we know it happened in Germany. We know there's a history there. We know that currently there have been reports of segregated maternity wards in various parts of Europe, not only Slovakia, right? Segregated maternity wards, and when it's not something like coerced or forced sterilizations, I can't remember the name of this report that struck me. I may have cited it in this article, but it talks about how Roma women were beaten, like literally when they're giving birth, the folks who are supposed to heal you and help you, and who took a Hippocratic oath and all of that, and the nurses like literally pounding on their stomachs, slapping them, cursing at them while they're giving birth, all sorts of abuses that I guess, this is the most egregious example would be actual, sterilization, but they're routine abuses. Everything from being segregated, right, in the hospitals to being turned away or being made to wait 8 hours for treatment, like that pregnant woman in, I think, Macedonia, who was turned away during COVID and died. I think she came back like 3-4 times to that hospital, and then she waited outside 8 hours. It's part of like a continuum of violence and neglect against Roma women. But yes, and there are other articles that talk about this. I think Gwendolyn Albert is another person who writes about this. But I'm going to look into the other countries and the questions you posed. It might be in the footnotes.
Thank you. Are there any other questions here in the room? Don't hesitate. You can just feel free. Yes, please. You want to come downstairs? Please.
I guess I can.
Nicht so nah.
Okay, alles klar. I have a really technical question, but first of all, I would really like to thank you, like, for sharing all that knowledge, but also really for sharing your anger and your sadness about it, because I think that's something that is missing a lot in an academic context, and especially with a topic like this, I think we should all be very, very angry. And yeah, I appreciate a lot that you would share that with us as well. Thank you so much. And yeah, my question is actually, like, pretty much at the beginning, you talked about a report and yeah, cited like the eugenic things that some medical staff and also some social workers said. And I just wanted to ask, I kind of missed in which context that report was published, like where it was published and also at which time. I kind of missed like the turn.
You mean the report where they were giving incentives for Roma women to get sterilizations and the 5,000 crowns and all of
No,
that?
no, like not
Oh.
this one, but pretty much at the beginning of your lecture, when you're kind of like wrapping up the discourse.
The European Women's Lobby stuff, maybe?
Yes,
Is that what
exactly.
you're referring to?
Yeah. Can you like when was that published, more or less?
One second. So I had taken quotes from their website, right, where they mentioned generally that that reproductive rights is really tantamount to accessing contraceptives, yada, yada, yada. So that was from their website, and that was this was published in 2017, so it must have been 2016. But there's are you referring to the other report, the one I said FEM?
Yeah, exactly. And when the
FEM
appendix.
European Parliament. With the appendix, yes, that one. That report, a good question. I actually, preparing for this, I came across it, and it's 2020.
Thank you. And like,
Yeah.
do you have the title just to check it?
I have in my notes that it's published by FEM Committee, FEMM. It's part of the European Parliament, and it was a report on Slovakia in 2020. And it was on abortion and access to contraceptives.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Thank you.
So are there any more questions?
You know what's funny? I didn't think I try to come off very friendly and calm and nice, and then I'm so surprised that that the anger still came out, because I try to put that in a box somewhere. So this is me being like calm and academic. So you can imagine. But yeah. I think that we're all we have these unrealistic expectations placed on us when we're reading things like this or hearing about things like this, to remain kind of removed and detached. And to some extent, that's easier when it's not your group, right, being who's the subject of the attack. Sometimes it's easier that way. But I think the young woman who came up a couple of minutes ago is right. We should all be outraged. And I guess I didn't do a good job of masking how angry I am, but it's a good thing.
Yeah, I think so too. We have one more question.
Thanks, Alex, for the wonderful talk. I've learned a lot from you. Because we are in Germany, I'm trying to come to Germany with our thoughts and with the historical experiences. As far as I'm concerned, there were in the 80s in Germany, in migration contexts, plenty of compulsory sterilization, systematic compulsory sterilization of women, Muslim women, women from former Yugoslavian, and partly without making any differences if they are Muslim or not Muslim. There were many cases. Do you know anything about them regarding like court cases in your work with focus on Europe?
No, I unfortunately do not, because it's not shocking that other women of other groups were targeted, because here in the U.S. also there were Black women targeted, Puerto Rican women, Native American women. So, but no, as far as making it to the European Court of Human Rights, I'm not aware. And I wasn't really aware of the history in Germany.
Yeah.
So,
Actually, the hidden question behind that is partly most of these women were also Romani women. You know, they were considered only as women from former Yugoslavian. So in that term, it was kind of for me interesting case to know if there are some in your work you could just pick up or find out.
I don't. I can look into it.
Yeah.
I can look into it.
Thank you.
Jane has one more question, another question.
Ob sie nochmal erklären kann, diesen Shift zwischen Zwangssterilisation und Zwangsgeburt. Das habe ich nicht, sie hat da so eine Verbindung hergestellt.
Das habe ich nicht verstanden.
If you can explain.
The shift between the coercive sterilization and the coercive giving birth,
The compulsory childbirth.
fertility.
The shift, or the relationship.
Also sie hat an einer Stelle davon gesprochen.
At one point you talked about a shift between the
Sterilization
the
and
f-
birth.
the forced sterilization and the forced birth. For Romani women, you mean?
Yes, I understood.
Oh, okay.
Well, I think she's referring to the part where initially when Romani women were bringing up, were trying to bring up gendered issues, right? A lot of the Romani leadership at that time would only let them bring up certain issues, right? In like world fora. So coerced or forced sterilization was permitted because it was framed as a race issue. It was genocide against all Roma. This is an act of genocide against us. You're sterilizing our women, right? So if you don't talk about the gendered aspect of that, then what is the outcome? The outcome is the duty is placed on Romani women to give birth, right? So if you're attacking the race and it's an act of genocide to sterilize women, the other side of that coin is these women are supposed to give birth. These women are made to give birth, to have babies. It's a duty to the race, right? So when you're looking at it through a race-only frame, if you're not looking at the gendered aspect, then it becomes, you need to have these babies to keep our race going. The more babies you pop out, the better Roma you are. The more you're supporting our people, our nation, our ability to survive. So then that's the other side of that coin if you don't talk about the gendered dimension of it, right? It can shift to the other side,
It's a very interesting.
in my opinion.
Yeah, come here. She said, Jane said, it's very interesting, and she just wanted confirmation. She already had that idea, but wasn't that sure. And
Yeah.
thank you so much. I would say if there are not any further question, probably we'd be lucky to have you here in February for the round
I
table.
would love to come down to for the round table in February. I would love it. I can't promise that I'm not going to pack my anger in one of my luggages,
Please,
but
please.
I can promise that I
Please.
can leave some of it behind, only bring a little luggage of anger, but I can't leave it all behind. I can't. I'm going to have to bring some of it. But I can't wait to meet you in person. You are such an inspiration. You're such a huge blessing to have met, and I'm inspired by you and everything you've accomplished. It's
No,
mind-boggling.
stop it.
It really is.
So Alex, let's talk about thank you so much. Thank you. I haven't really. I think we're gonna have some questions when you come here because as I'm working on this subject, like I said, and habe ich was Technik? Okay. But anyways, I wanted to thank you. If you will be here, we would have flowers for you right now and give you a hug
I love flowers.
and go out for dinner. So we're gonna have to do that when you come in February.
Yes, I can't wait to see you guys in person. Thank you so much for attending this, and thank you for having this program, it's so important to have this forum. It's really, really important. You guys are doing amazing work there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much in the name of all of us, of our Uni Romnja team, of Romani Pen, of the Uni Romnja, and yes, Oprea Romnja.
Love it. Thank you so much. I will see you guys in around a month or so in person.
Yes. Okay.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you to everybody here. Thank you
Yes, and
so
thank you
much.
for the interpreters and everyone. Winnie, everyone who was bearing with me with my jumping around.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Nächste Woche haben wir wieder vor Ort und freuen uns, wenn ihr zahlreich erscheint. So next week we're gonna be again here in person. It's gonna be Luisa Medigliano, and we're looking forward for her lecture and are happy to have you all next week here with us. Thank you.